Chapter 6 Twilight Lands Love's Gifts, the Valley of Selfishness, the country of unrest, the miser's land, the gambler's land. When my period of work in any place was finished, I used to return to the Twilight Land to rest in another large building which belonged to our brotherhood. It was somewhat like the other place in appearance, only not quite so dark, nor so dismal, nor so bare. And in the little room which belonged to each there were such things as we had earned as the rewards of our labors. For instance, in my room, which was still somewhat bare-looking, I had one great treasure. This was a picture of my love. It seemed more like a reflection of her in a mirror than a mere painted image, for when I looked intently at her she would smile back at me and answer, as though her spirit was conscious of my gaze. And when I wished very much to know what she was doing, my picture would change and show me. This was regarded by all my companions as a great and wonderful privilege, and I was told it was as much the result of her love and constant thought for me as of my own efforts to improve. Since then I have been shown how this living image was thrown up on the light of the astral plane and then projected into its frame in my room, but I cannot explain it more fully in this book. Another gift from my darling was a white rosebud, which I had in a small vase, and which never seemed to fade or wither, but remained fresh and fragrant and ever an emblem of her love. So that I called her my white rose. I had so longed for a flower. I had so loved flowers on earth, and I had seen none since I saw those my darling put upon my grave. In this land there were no flowers, not even a leaf or blade of grass. Not a tree or a shrub, however stunted, for the dry arid soil of our selfishness had no blossom or green thing to give to any one of us. And it was when I told her this during one of the brief visits I used here, and when through her own hand I was able to write short messages, it was, I say, when I told her that there was not one fair thing for me to look upon save only the picture of herself, that she asked that I might be given a flower from her. And this white rosebud was brought to my room by a spirit friend and left for me to find when I returned from earth and her. Ah, you who have so many flowers that you do not value them enough and leave them to wither unseen. You can scarce realize what joy this blossom brought to me, nor how I have so treasured it in her picture and some loving words she once wrote to me, that I have carried them with me from sphere to sphere as I have risen, and shall, I hope, treasure them evermore. From this twilight land I took many journeys and saw many strange and different countries, but all bore the same stamp of coldness and desolation. One place was a great night sky overhead. Here again not a blade of grass, not one poor stunted shrub was to be seen, not one touch of color or brightness anywhere, only this dull desolation of gray stones. Those who dwelt in this valley had centered their lives and their affections in themselves and had shut up their hearts against all the warmth and beauty of unselfish love. They had lived only for themselves, their own gratification, their own ambitions. And now they saw nothing but themselves and the great desolation of their hard selfish lives around them. There were a great many beings flitting uneasily about in this valley, but strange to say they had been so centered in themselves that they had lost the power to see anyone else. These unhappy beings were invisible to each other until such time as the thought of another and the desire to do something for someone besides themselves should awaken. When they would become conscious of those near to them, and through their efforts to lighten another's lot they would improve their own. Till at last their stunted affections would expand and the hazy valley of selfishness would hold them in its chains no more. Beyond this valley I came upon a great, dry, sandy-looking tract of country where there was a scanty straggling vegetation, and where the inhabitants had begun in some places to make small attempts at gardens near their habitations. In some places these habitations were clustered so thickly together that they formed small towns and cities. But all bore the desolate ugly look which came from the spiritual poverty of the inhabitants. This also was a land of selfishness and greed, although not of such complete indifference to. A wanderer in the spirit land spilled 19 others' feelings as in the grey valley, and therefore they sought for a certain amount of companionship even with those around them. Many had come from the grey valley, but most were direct from the earth life and were now, poor souls, struggling to rise a little higher. And wherever this was the case and an effort was made to overcome their own selfishness, then the dry soil around their homes would begin to put forth tiny blades of grass and little stunted shoots of shrubs. Such miserable hovels as were in this land. Such ragged, repulsive, wretched-looking people, like tramps or beggars, yet many had been amongst earth's wealthiest and most eminent in fashionable life, and had enjoyed all that luxury could give. But because they had used their wealth only for themselves and their own enjoyments, giving to others but the paltry crumbs that they could spare from their own wealth, and hardly notice that they had given them, because of this, I say, they were now here in this twilight land, poor as beggars in the true spiritual wealth of the soul which may be earned in the earthly life alike by the richest king or the poorest beggar, and without which those who come over to the spirit land need come here to dwell where all are alike poor in spirit thing would wrangle and quarrel and complain that they had not been fairly treated in being in such a place, seeing what had been their positions in earth's life. They would blame others as being more culpable than themselves in the matter, and wake 1,000 excuses, 1,000 pretenses, to anyone who would listen to them in the story of what they would call their wrongs. Others would still be trying to follow out the schemes of their earthly lives, and would try to make their hearers believe that they had found means of ending all this weary life of discomfort, and would plot and plan and try to carry out their own schemes, and spoil those of others as being likely to interfere with theirs. And so on would go the weary round of life in this land of unrest. To all whom I found willing to listen to me I gave some word of hope, some thought of encouragement or help to find the true way out of this country, and so passed on to it and journeyed into the land of misers, a land given over to them alone. For few have sympathy with true misers save those who also share their all-absorbing desire to hoard simply for the pleasure of hoarding. In this country were dark crooked-looking beings with long claw-like fingers, scratching in the black soil like birds of prey in search of stray grains of gold that here and there rewarded their toil. And when they had found any they would wrap them up in little wallets they carried and thrust them into their bosoms that they might lie next to their hearts, as the thing of all things most dear to them. As a rule they were lonely, solitary beings, who avoided each other by instinct, lest they should be robbed of their cherished treasure. Here I found nothing that I could do. Only one solitary man listened for a brief moment to what I had to say, or he returned to his hunt in the earth for treasure, furtively watching me till I was gone lest I should learn what he had already got. The others were all so absorbed in their search for treasure they could not even be made conscious of my presence, and I soon passed on from that bleak land. From the miser's country I passed downwards into a dark sphere, which was really below the earth in a sense of being even lower in its spiritual inhabitants than parts of the earth plane. Here it was very much like the land of unrest, only that the spirits who dwelt here were worse and more degraded looking. There was no attempt made at cultivation, and the sky overhead was almost dark like night, the light being only such as enabled them to see each other and the objects near them. Whereas in the land of unrest there were but wrangling and discontent and jealousy, here there were fierce fights and bitter quarrels. Here were gamblers and drunkards, betting men, card sharpers, commercial swindlers, profligates, and thieves of every kind, from the thief of the slums to his well-educated counterpart in the higher circles of earth life. All whose instincts were roguish or dissipated, all as well a life had not constant association on earth with this class of men deteriorated and degraded them to the level of their companions, so that at death they had gravitated to this dark sphere, drawn down by ties of association. It was to this last class that I was sent, for amongst them there was hope that all sense of goodness and right was not quenched. A wanderer in the spirit lands page 20, and that the voice of one crying to them in the wilderness of their despair might be heard, and lead them back to a better land. The wretched houses or dwellings of this dark land of misery were many of them large spacious places, but all stamped with the same appalling look of uncleanness, foulness and decay. They resembled large houses to be seen in some of our slums, once handsome mansions and fine palaces, the abodes of luxury, which had become the haunts of the lowest denizens of vice and crime. Here and there would be great lonely tracts of country with a few scattered wretched houses, mere hovels, and in other places the buildings and the people were huddled together in great gloomy degraded-looking copies of your large cities of earth. Everywhere squalor and dirt and wretchedness reigned. Nowhere was there one single bright or beautiful or gracious thing for the eye to rest upon in all this scene of desolation, made thus by the spiritual emanations from the dark beings who dwelt there. Amongst these wretched inhabitants I wandered with my little star of pure light, so small that it was but a bright spark flickering about in the darkness as I moved. Yet around me it shed a soft pale light as from a star of hope that shone for those not too blinded by their own selfish evil passions to behold it. Here and there I would come upon some crouched in a doorway or against a wall, or in some miserable room, who would arouse themselves sufficiently to look at me with my light and listen to the words I spoke to them, and would begin to seek for the better way, the returning path to those upper spheres from which they had fallen by their sins. Some I would be able to induce to join me in my work of helping others, but as a rule they could only think of their own miseries, and long for something higher than their present surroundings. And even this, small as it seems, was one step, and that one of thinking how to help others forward as well would soon follow. One day in my wanderings through this country I came to the outskirts of a large city in the middle of a wide desolate plain. The soil was black and arid, more like those great cinder heaps that are seen near your iron works than anything I can liken it to. I was amongst a few dilapidated, tumble-down little cottages that formed a sort of fringe between the unhappy city and the desolate plain, when my ears caught the sound of quarreling and shouting coming from one of them, and curiosity made me draw near to see what the dispute might be about, and if even here there was more like a barn than a house. Of the room, and round it upon coarse little wooden stools were seated about a dozen or so of men. Such men, it is almost an insult to manhood to give them a name. They were more like orangutans, with the varieties of pigs and wolves and birds of prey expressed in their coarse bloated distorted features. Such faces, such misshapen bodies, such distorted limbs, I can in no way describe them. They were clothed in various grotesque and ragged semblances of their former earthly finery, some in the fashion of centuries ago, others in more modern garb, yet all alike ragged, dirty, and unkempt, the hair disheveled, the eyes wild and staring and glowing now with the fierce light of passion, now with the sullen fire of despair and vindictive malice. To me, then, it seemed that I had reached the lowest pit of hell, but since then I have seen a region lower still, far blacker, far more horrible, inhabited by beings so much fiercer, so much lower, that beside them these were tame and human. Later on I shall describe more fully these lowest beings, when I come to that part of my wanderings that took me into their kingdoms in the lowest hell. But the spirits whom I now saw fighting in this cottage were quarreling over a bag of coins that lay on the table. It had been found by one of them and given to be gambled for by the whole party. The dispute seemed to be because each wanted to take possession of it himself without regard to the rights of anyone else at all. It was simply a question of the strongest, and already they were menacing each other in a violent fashion. The finder of the money, or rather the spiritual counterpart of our earthly money, was a young man, under 30 I should say, who still possessed the remains of good looks, and but for the marks that dissipation had planted on his face would have seemed unfit for his present surroundings and degraded associates. He was arguing that the money was his, and though he had given it to be played for fairly he objected to be robbed of it by anyone. I felt I had no business there, and amidst a wild chorus of indignant cries and protestations that they supposed they were as well able to say what was honest as he was, I turned and left them. I had proceeded but a short way, and was almost opposite another deserted little hovel when the whole wild crew came bugling and fighting out of the cottage, wrestling with each other to get near the young man with the bag of money, whom the foremost of them were beating and kicking and trying to deprive of it. This one of them succeeded in doing, whereupon they all set upon him, while the young man broke away from them and began running towards me. In a moment there was a wild yell set up to catch him and beat him for an impostor and a cheat, since the bag was empty of gold and had only stones in it. Stories, having turned, not into withered leaves. Just before I realized it, the wretched young man was clutching hold of me and crying out to me to save him from those devils. And the whole lot were coming down upon us in hot pursuit of their victim. Quick as thought I sprang into the empty hovel which gave us the only hope of asylum, dragging the unfortunate young man with me, and slamming the door I planted my back against it to keep our pursuers out. My goodness, how they did yell and stamp and storm and try to batter in that door, and how I did brace myself up and exert all the force of mind and body to keep them out. I did not know it then, But I know now that unseen powers helped me and held fast that door till, baffled and angry that they could not move it, they went off at last to seek for some fresh quarrel or excitement elsewhere.